And Jai Bhim to all. We are starting from section 22. Can you appeal to reason and ask the Hindus to discard caste as being contrary to reason? That raises the question. Is a Hindu free to follow his reason? Manu has laid down three sanctions to which every Hindu must conform in the matter of his behavior. Veda Smriti, Sadacharaha Uvasacha, Priya Matamanaha. Here, there is no place for reason to play its part. A Hindu must follow either Veda, Smriti, or Sadachar. He cannot follow anything else. In the first place, how are the texts of the Vedas and Smritis to be interpreted whenever any doubt arises regarding their meaning? On this important question, the view of Manu is quite definite. He says, Yova manid te mule hetushrahasya dvijaha sa sadhu birha bahikaskaryo nashitko vedandikaha. According to this rule, rationalism as a canon of interpreting the Vedas and Smritis is absolutely condemned. It is regarded to be a weak as atheism, and the punishment provided for it is excommunication. Thus, where a matter is covered by the Veda or the Smriti, a Hindu cannot resort to rational thinking, even when there is a conflict between Vedas and Smritis on matters on which they have given a positive injunction. The solution is not left to reason. When there is a conflict between two Shrutis, both are to be regarded as of equal authority. Either of them may be followed. No attempt is to be made to find out which of these two occurred the reason. This is made clear by Manu. Shruti dvadham tu yatra sa patatra dhrava smritu. When there is a conflict between Shruti and Sindriti, the Shruti must prevail. But here too, no attempt must be made to find out which of the two occurs with the reason. This is laid down by Manu in the following shloka. Ya Veda Byaha Srityo Yasya Kasya Kridishtaha Sravasta Nishpalaha Priti Tamonishtaha Hiteha Smritihi. Again, when there is a conflict between two Smritis, the Manu Smriti must prevail, but no attempt is to be made to find out which of the two occurs with the reason. This is the ruling given by Brihaspati. Vedayatva pani bandirotva pramanayam hi manoha smrityah manvartha parita tuya smritah sa na shashayate. It is therefore clear that in any matter on which the Shrutis and Smritis have given a positive direction, a Hindu is not free to use his reasoning faculty. The same rule is laid down in the Mahabharata. Puranam mano dharma sango vedashya chikitsamam aga siddhani chatvari na hantavayani hetubiha. He must abide by their directions. The caste and varna are matters which are dealt with the Vedas and the Smritis, and consecutively. Appeal to reason can have no effect on Hindu so far as caste and varna are concerned. Not only the Shastras do not permit the Hindu to use his reason in the decision of the question, but they have taken care to see that no occasion is left to examine in a rational way the foundation of his belief in caste and varna. It must be a source of silent amusement to many a non-Hindu to find hundreds and thousands of Hindu breaking caste on certain occasions, such as railway journey and foreign travel, and it enduring to maintain caste for the rest of their lives. The explanation of these phenomena discloses another factor on the reasoning faculties of the Hindus. Man's life is generally habitual and unreflective. Reflective thought, in the sense of active, persistence, and careful consideration of any belief, are supposed to suppose from of knowledge in the light of the grounds that support it, and further conclusion to which it tends, is quite rare and arises only in a situation which present a dilemma, a crisis. Railway journeys and foreign travels are really occasion of crisis in the life of a Hindu, and it is natural to expect a Hindu to ask himself why he should maintain of caste at all. If he cannot maintain it at all times, but he does not, he breaks caste at one step and proceeds to observe it at the next without raising any questions. The reason for this astonishing conduct is to be found in the rule of Shastras, which direct him to maintain caste as far as possible and to undergo Prayanshitya when he cannot by the theory of Prayachitta. The Shastras, by following a spirit of compromise, have given caste a perpetual lease of life and have smoothed reflective thought which would have otherwise led to the discussion of the notion of caste. There have been many who have worked in the cause of the abolition of caste and untouchability. Of those who cannot be mentioned, Ramanuja, Kabir, and others stand off prominently. Can you appeal to this act of these reformers and exhort the Hindus to follow them? It is true that Manu has included Sadachar as one of the sanctions along with Shruti and Smriti. Indeed, Sadachar has been given a higher place than Shastras. येदवच्चारयते येन धर्माय वधार्मेमेव वा देशासचरणं नित्यं charitram tadvikirtam. According to this sadachar, whether it is a dharmya or adharmya, in accordance with shastras or contrary to shastras, must be followed. But what is the meaning of sadachar? If anyone were to suppose that sadachar means right or good acts, that is, act of good and righteous man, he would find himself greatly mistaken. Sadachar does not mean good acts or act of good man. It means ancient customs, good or bad. The following verse makes this clear. Yasmin deshe ya acharah parampaya kram pangatah varnani kila sarveshama sa sadachara uchayate. As though to warn people against the view that sadachar means good acts or acts of good man, and fearing that people might understand it that way and follow the acts of a good man. The Smritis have commanded the Hindus in unmistakable terms not to follow even gods in their good deeds. If they are contrary to Shruti, Smriti, and Sadachar, this may sound to be most extraordinary, most perverse, but the fact remains that Na Deva Charitam chariot is an injection issued to the Hindus by their Shastras. Reason and morality are of the two most powerful weapons in the armory of a reformer. To deprive him of the use of these weapons is to disable him for action. How are you going to break up caste if people are not free to consider whether it accords with reason? How are you going to break up caste if people are not free to consider whether it accords with morality? The wall built around caste is impregnable, and the material of which it is built contains none of the combustible stuff of reason and morality. Add to this the fact that inside this wall stands the army of Brahmins, who form the intellectual class. Brahmins who are the natural leaders of the Hindus. Brahmins who are there not as mere mercenary soldiers but as an army fighting for its homeland. And you will get an idea why I think that breaking up of caste among the Hindus is well nigh impossible. At any rate, it will take ages before a branch is made. But whether the doing of the deed takes time or whether it can to be done quickly, you must not forget that if you wish to bring about and breach in the system, that you have got to apply the dynamite to the Vedas and the Shastras, which deny any part to reason, to Vedas and Shastras, which deny any part to morality. You must destroy the religion of the Shrutis and the Smritis. Nothing else will avail. This is my considered view of the matter. Section 23.
We pause here because I think this section has to be thought through. So we will take a little bit of reflection on it, and we will go on. I think when we read this section, important thing that we have to bear in mind is that the Vedas, by which, or the Shastras or the Smritis, they are, as Baba Saheb Ambedkar said, they are irrational and amoral, immoral. So there is no reasoning, there is no morality. And if you fight against it, beyond this wall also there is an army of the Brahmins who are trying to protect their homeland, means their power. Okay, so here I think the most important sentence, word in this particular section is the reflective thought. And I thought I will tell you what is the reflective thought, because this understanding of reflective thought is so important for all of us to understand. Okay, so this concept of reflective thought is a training in thinking that we all need to practice, and therefore we have to understand this word reflective thought, reflection, reflective thinking. This word comes from the Deweyan philosophy. We all think. Now, how do we all think? Sometimes we just think aimlessly. Something goes on in our mind, and we think all the time without any direction, without any goal, without any output out of it. Sometimes we have a thinking which is based on certain belief, but those beliefs are not based on any evidence. Okay, so reflective thought is actually, as Baba Saheb Ambedkar said, active, persistent and careful consideration of any belief or supposed form or knowledge in the light of grounds that support it and further conclusions to which it tends. So reflective thought, when we this sentence has come from a very important book written by John Dewey called How We Think. And I think this reflective thought, if the training is that whatever there is a belief system, we try to examine the evidence of it. And if that belief is true, what is the conclusion out of it? So it is not a dull thinking. It is not something which is haphazard thinking, which we do all the time. Sometimes we daydream, sometimes we build castles in the air, sometimes we have certain ideas accepted without examining the evidences on which those belief systems are made. But reflective thought doesn't mean any of that. It means a careful consideration, a persistence, active inquiry into any belief. Okay, and this particular training of mind is so important to create a reflection, a reflective thought. So we do not accept anything on the basis of something given to us by the society, something that is coming out of some religious books, or somebody is telling us. We don't accept it just like that. We employ our mind, we persistently work through it, we consider different grounds for those beliefs, and we examine those grounds for the belief, and we try to see whether that particular thing is true or false. Okay, so reflective thought also means, in other words, an experimental thought, just like the scientist will do. So for example, when the scientist has to prove something, they will have some certain hypothesis, and they will say that if this is correct, this is going to happen. Okay, so and then they conduct the experiment to prove their points are correct or not correct, right? Similarly, like for example, the belief system. Now take any belief. the existence of God. We believe in the existence of God. Now that's a belief system. Okay. Now if we apply the reflective thought to it, then we have to understand whether when our belief in the God, what are the evidences for that? Okay. Then we examine the evidences in the light of to prove that the God exists. So reflective thought is so important. It actually, we all need to train ourselves in the reflective thoughts. Now when we look at these Vedas or the Shrutis and the Shastras, the striking point is that they have all denied the authority of the reason. They said that because it's written in the book, you have to believe it. Okay, you cannot question it, you cannot apply your reflective thought to it. And because you are not ready to apply your reflective thought to it, you cannot question it. And when you cannot question it, we don't know whether it's true or false. Number one. Number two is the test of morality is so important, because they talk about sadachar. But what is the sadachar? Here sadachar means practicing your caste duties. Sadachar doesn't mean like the 5 precepts of Buddhism, where you practice 5 precepts without reference to any books, because you don't want other people to behave with you the way you won't behave with them. If somebody wants to hurt you, you will feel bad. You won't accept it if somebody wants to trample you down. Panati pata vermani. So because you don't want somebody to behave with you like that, you don't do that with others. Do you understand what I'm getting at? So this reflective thought is so important in terms of the reasoning and also in terms of morality. And there is a very important concept that Baba Ambedkar has given: reflective morality. So the morality that we believe in or that we follow in our life is without reflection. We don't reflect. We just try to follow whatever is written in the books, what is coming out of the culture, what is taught by some people, but we do not reflect on the morality. Say, for example, the morality of the caste. We do not reflect whether is this the way we should behave with other human beings based on the assumption that they are lower than us or they are higher than us. On further reflection, we know that all human beings are the same. There is no basis of any discrimination, isn't it? Now, these two things, reasons and morality, are so important, and I think this is what Baba Ambedkar is getting at it in terms of in this 22nd section of Annihilation of Caste. And I think this is so important for all of us to understand that reflective thought, which would have otherwise led to the destruction of the notion of caste. Now there is a notion of caste, we cannot destroy it. The only way by destroying it is by cultivating the reflective thought, isn't it? And Baba says, because it is impossible to destroy it, because there is inside this combustible stuff contains none of the combustible stuff. Combustible stuff means something that will burn it. There is no substance inside the Shastras and the Vedas and the Smritis that will implode it, burn it internally. Okay, so I thought that was some of the reflections that I wanted to give it to you. Anybody would like to say anything on this reflective thought and morality and reason?
There is no place for morality in Shastras and Vedas.
Right.
And they cannot question, because they are compelled to believe Shastras.
Mm-hmm.
They are not free. They have no freedom of thoughts. They are compelled to follow those, and there is no place for morality, which the reformer weapon. It is the reformer's weapon.
Right.
Morality and reason.
Anybody? Did you get what I mean by the reflective thought? This is not easy to understand, because it's a training of mind that we need to cultivate. We cannot accept any belief without examining its evidence.
Hello,
Hello, yes.
Samiksha here, sir.
Yes, Lisa.
Yeah, just now you explained about this reflective thinking. I was just reflecting on this Manu and whatever Smriti we are discussing, and so I was just reflecting on Manu that I have this belief system, and everyone also knows that Manu wrote the Smritis and he was the propagator of it and all that. But mm, what are the thoughts of Baba Saheb? Like because in volume 1, I get to read that there were castes before Manu. So Manu was only the propagator or upholder of this law of caste. So to reflect on this, what were Baba Saheb's views that mm, were there? What was the origin of this caste? And Manu is the only origin of this law of caste. Can we reflect on this? I don't know if I made clear.
There was this idea of Varna system in the Purush Sukta, in the Vedas, and as Baba Sahib Ambedkar has said that this Purush Sukta was introduced in the 10th mandala of the Riga Veda. And Manusmriti was codified, written as a legal document after a long time, like 300 AD or around that, maybe 200 years back. And that was after the fall of Buddhism in this country. Now the idea of caste, how it got into being, is explained by Baba Sahib Ambedkar in his paper, 1916 paper, the genesis of caste, and we can study that, but it's not difficult to know how the caste comes into being, because the enclosed class, even when we enclose ourselves from the other community, we automatically form a caste. And there is a concept of social endosmosis. When we don't enclose ourselves into a particular class, we do not form a caste. Okay.
Yes.
So this enclosed class, and it kept intact by the intermarriages, marrying within.
Yes.
And that's why it's very important that in order to break the caste system, there has to be social endosmosis, which means a free flow of exchange or communication between all these enclosed groups, enclosed classes. And I think we can think about it. But coming to the idea of reflective thinking, reflective thinking is what made human beings, because reflective thinking also entails that we are able to extract some common point out of some phenomena and communicate to other human beings. So for example, if I say that it's raining now, what's raining in Pune is different from what is happening in, say for example, Delhi. But we have created this word after reflection that fits this phenomena, is called raining. And that's how I communicate to you that I say it's raining in Pune, so you understand what is happening. But the animals do not have this kind of the uh, uh, power to have the abstraction in the thoughts or to reflect on it back. And that's why human consciousness, there are two kinds of consciousness. One is reflexive, so where we reflex, and there is another form of consciousness which is called reflective consciousness. So for example, if there is this, if we study the minds of the animals, we know that they cannot but react to something. But human beings have this reflective consciousness where they can reflect on their own consciousness back. Okay, so for example, I was talking about the different belief system which are in our head, and we just accept it as it is without reflecting back on it, isn't it? Then we do not know whether certain things is right or wrong, or whether it's an accepted belief. So for example, here, as Alka madam has pointed out, that reason and morality are the two most powerful weapons in the armory of a reformer. So for example, those we don't know whether we would be able to eradicate the caste system, but these two weapons we all have to practice. Reason, how we reflect, how we think, how we clearly understand certain things. Now it's not easy to do it because we are by nature we are trained to not think reflectively, because reflective thinking takes a lot of efforts. It's not easy to think reflectively. We need to collect a lot of information. We need to read widely. We need to shape up our thoughts. We need to find we have to, if there is one belief, we have to understand the background, the evidences of those belief, and based on those belief, what are the consequences of those belief. So in other words, the reflective thinking can also be called dynamic thinking, where we think dynamically in terms of the dynamic thoughts, in terms of the dynamic terms. Most of the times our thinking is very static. We think in terms of the words, which also we sometimes don't understand. So for example, when we say caste, it's just a word, but we don't try to understand what is caste, how it operates. So here, if we are traveling in a train with somebody, or going abroad with somebody, we don't care, because that we don't apply that time any of our thinking. We just go ahead. But if you are in a village, or if you are in a relationship, or if you are having some some exchange, intercourse with the other human being in terms of a social being, then this particular psychology of caste comes into our head. So I think this is very important, that we have to understand how we cultivate this process of reasoning, and this is the only way by which we can destroy the notion of caste. There is no other way by which we cannot have other belief system to replace it. Then we will be caught up in the net of the beliefs. So we have to apply our rational mind. We have to apply our thinking. For example, we can think in terms of the evolution. Now the evolution has conclusively proved that the human beings are the same species. There are no different species among the human beings. So there are like species in there are in the animal kingdom, there are species. In the plant kingdom, there are species. But in the human beings, there are no species. We are the single species. That is what was the great discovery of Charles Darwin. So when we apply this kind of a evolutionary thinking, which Baba Sahib Ambedkar very much appreciated, we begin to see that there is no scope for any ranking among the human beings. All human beings are the same. So as a reformer, as somebody who is concerned about annihilation of the caste, we have to have this one weapon. Another weapon we should have is a morality. Morality in a sense that how we relate with other human beings based on their humanity, not based on any of their attributes, like whether they are men or women, or whether they are homosexual, bisexuals, or whether they are white, they are blacks, whether they are Indians, whether they are from Pakistan. Doesn't matter to us. What matters to us is that they are just like us, human beings, and how we relate with them as a human being. So removing this kind of the conditioning, and relating with other human beings as the human beings, as the universal law. Caste cannot be the universal law. It is impossible to have that kind of a system throughout the world. So even so caste by nature is immoral, unethical, and this unethical is made ethical in the Hindu social order by giving it a sanctity of the Vedas and the Shastras and the Smritis. Right?
Yes, sir.
Yes. And in Dhamma, we have to follow Panchashil.
Yes.
These principles have been given first importance to morality. So following Panchashil is must. But morality has no place in religion of Shastras and Vedas.
Perfect.
So Baba Sahib says that if you want to break this system, if you want to annihilate the caste, then you must apply dynamics to the Vedas and Shastras. Which
Yes, but
part to morality.
yes, but as Baba Sahib says that there is no dynamite inside the Vedas. There is no scope for bringing any dynamite. It's such a closed system. So what we have to do is we have to bring the dynamite from somewhere. I don't know where, but we have to bring dynamite from somewhere out.
Religion of this system.
Anybody wants to say anything before we move on?
Destroy the religion of the city.
If not, then we should go on further. Okay.
Okay.
What he wants to say regarding we must destroy the religion of the Shrutis and Smritis.
Yes. If we want to annihilate the caste, it's very important to destroy these rule-based, code-based Smritis. Right now, so long as people believe that something is sacred and the books are sacred and whatever written there is sacrosanct, it cannot be changed. It's Sanatan. It is as it is. We have to accept it. So long as this belief in the Shastras exists, the caste cannot be annihilated.
Yes.
Pankaj.
Yes, sir. This actually in the Vedas and Shastras in the contemporary time, if you see, I was just going through few of this television serials, mythological, and the timing in which they are broadcasted. If you see, all prime channels, including Sony, Star Plus, DD National, and Marathi channels also, from 7 p.m. almost to 9 or 8:30 p.m. in this region, when this time is a relaxation time, when people come and watch television in most of the period, there they will run mythological serials. So in the contemporary world, the mind of Hindus are captured by this type of Vedas and Shastras.
Yes.
Now let us see, Dr. Ambedkar is saying to put dynamite on the Vedas and Shastra. So for me it is very clear, the contemporary Vedas and Shastras are nothing but this TV serial. Just one example. There can be many such examples. So how we can put dynamite on such serials once they are capturing the very important time of mind, 7 p.m. when the person is with the family saying the thing, and you change any channel, same thing is going on. They are competitor, yet they are playing the same thing. It includes Ramayana, Mahabharat, Sai, Mahadev, Hanuman. My God, you see the name of serials. I gone through this, internet for getting this time against the serial. So it is very discouraging. If we can reflect on this, how it can be broken. What I think, especially at least our kids and ourselves, we can definitely keep away from this thing by awareness. That is one way.
Yes, we should refrain from seeing those serials. We can't help because social media, they want to display all these. Only thing, we have to build our social media and constant brainwashing of our people by teaching them Dhamma, morality, and how advantage good our Dhamma is.
Correct, man. At least we are away from that. But the problem is, again, we not talking on the depression mode, but these Hindus, OBCs, they are so much into it. It is difficult to break them. Even after that, if you should take any serial, it is showing them nothing but the mythology, chamatkar, what nonsense and what nonsense. So how to get out from this? The mind of those people, it is all mind game. This is purely the mind game.
So we should not focus our mind there.
No, we are, if we are focusing mind on that, then nothing can fail that badly. What we are talking, how to cultivate their mind away from that. That is the whole thing. But as we know, the first thing is understanding. Anywhere, the first thing is understanding of that problem. So we are ensured, or we should be ensured that we are not into it. Then only we can, try for others not to do that. That is the thing, man. So I thought it is important to bring to this forum, and I put that point basically.
Yeah, I think this is very logical what you said, and I think in the context of the speech where Baba Saheb Ambedkar is addressing the Jat Paat Tolak Mandal, he's suggesting them that they have to go beyond intercaste dinings and intercaste marriages. He's telling them that if you really are serious about Jat Paat Todo, if you really want to break the caste, this is the only solution by which you can break the caste. Now, one of the takeaway as a human being for us is how we cultivate our own reasoning, how we cultivate our own morality, because we know that in the longer run, these things matter. Otherwise, a lot of human sufferings comes. So, for example, we know that there is a group of people in this country which wants to keep people in the dark, and we know that a lot of our OBC brothers and sisters, they fall in their trap of the religion, and it's our duty to talk about these things like that. But it's also very important that those who want to come out of it, because it's a personal process that a lot of us have to
Yeah,
go through it. So if we had no Baba Sahib Ambedkar, we would have been doing the same thing. We would have been watching the teledramas, we have been watching this, we have been naming our kids in the Hindu mythological sense, and so on and so forth. So I think we have to see that we have this attitude, ultimately cultivated by those with us, along with us, and we help each other to think rationally like that. So it's a process. We don't know, when this, because it's also political, that because of this particular mythologies, we know that some parties come into power, and that's how they benefit materially, and so on and so forth. But a lot of people in India these days don't understand it. But there are like reformers, particularly in Tamil Nadu. Like Tamil Nadu, because of this Dravidian movement started by Periyar, we see that the Hinduization or the Brahmanization is very much opposed in Tamil Nadu, and that we can see in the Lok Sabha results of last election, that it was the only state that has registered this Brahminical onslaught on their state. And I think there are now sections of people among the OBCs who are really trying to understand. So our question is to really how we can create a discussion about these very sensitive topics, because the religious topics are very sensitive. And our talent should be how we write, we express, we talk in the rational and moral terms. So these two pillars are very important: rationality and morality, so important for us. Otherwise, sometimes what happens in terms, when we talk, we have vested interest, and when we have vested interest, people do not see it moral. So we have to always uphold the moral ground as to why we are doing it, and we have to apply our reasoning. So I think the key term here is how we reason, how we keep that moral mindset alive in us. Otherwise, we play in their same game plans again and again and again and again. So I think it's very important for us to really stand out, and that's why Baba Sahib Ambedkar embraced Buddhism, because he wanted us to stand out of away from that system which comes into and start colonizing our mind all the time. So decolonization of mind is a process that can only begin with reasoning and morality. So we have to begin it, we have to expand it, and we have to resist it, and we have to go ahead with it. Uma?
Yeah, I had a more clarification or a question. The alternate theory that you hear is that in the Vedic literature, not the Manusmriti or the Purusha Sukta, but the Vedic literature, caste was not a division by birth. It was a division that came because of behavior. It was individual based and not group based. Yeah. And purity and impurity was really based on character, ethical intent, and how the person behaved, good and bad deeds, not by birth. And over time, due to the corrupt practices, which could have been Brahminical practices or corrupt practices, this got completely replaced, and that's how the current system of caste came in. And this is another argument that one keeps hearing, but where is it in the Vedic literature? This is corruption. So this is not really what the core Hindu philosophy is of Sanatan Dharma or whatever. So I mean, when I have discussions, this is where I get stuck.
Yeah. Very good point, because these are the arguments made by the defenders of the Vedas. So the question is, we have to definitely ask, basically, if we look at the Vedic, Purush Sukta, for example, and we know that the Purush Sukta was the interpolation. It doesn't talk about the individual human beings. It talks about a class. For example, if you look into the Bible or if you look into Quran, they have also the stories of Genesis. So they have the Adam, there was God, and God said, let there be the light, and there was a light, and light was divided into dark and light. and day and night was formed, and then God made a beautiful garden, and then he thought, okay, who is going to enjoy this? So he made an image out of it and made a human being, Adam, the first human being. Then the Adam got bored, then what to do? So from his rib, God produced Eve, and then God told them, don't eat that fruit of passion, and they ate the fruit of passion, and that's how the whole humanity corrupted. Now that is the biblical story, that's a Quranic story.
Yes.
Hello, Mangesh sir. I think he lost the connection.
Frozen, no? Yeah.
Uma ma'am, would you like to say Mangesh sir's reply?
No, he was still explaining it, so I mean, I
Right.
haven't
Yeah.
got it completely. Yeah.
Okay, maybe the network issue. Okay, anyone else wants to focus light on the same?
I think what Pankaj
Yeah.
wanted to ask that we should convince the community, like OBC, SC, ST separately, rather than calling Hindu.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Actually, that is very important group, or that is very important, audience whom we cannot afford losing. There will be always groups talking against or in favor of this caste, or let us say Hinduism. But if we put on our thoughts in very rational way, no, they are going to accept it, because there is nothing other than they have to accept it, because there is no other go. And I tried this methodology in many groups, so people's mind, they at least get give a thought of what we are saying.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, then I think we should move on. And when Mangesh sir joins, he will continue with the explanation. I think
Yeah.
it will
That's,
be good, Uma ma'am. Yeah. Okay. Then we'll continue reading. Shashank, please.
Yes. Section 23.
Yeah.
Some may not understand what I mean by destruction of religion. Some may find the idea revolting to them, and some may find it revolutionary. Let me therefore explain my position. I do not know whether you draw a distinction between principles and rules, but I do. Not only I make a distinction, but I say that this distinction is real and important. Rules are practical. They are habitual ways of doing things according to prescriptions. But principles are intellectual. They are useful methods of judging things. Rules seek to tell an agent just what course of action to pursue. Principles do not prescribe a specific course of action. Rules, like cooking recipes, do tell just what to do and how to do it. A principle, such as that of justice, supplies a man head by reference to which he is to consider the bearings of his desires and purposes. It guides him in his thinking by suggesting to him the important consideration which he should bear in mind. This difference between rules and principle makes the acts done in pursuit of them different in quality and in content. Doing what is said to be good by virtue of a rule and doing good in the light of a principle are two different things. The principle may be wrong, but the act is conscious and responsible. The rule may be right, but the act is mechanical. A religious act may not be a correct act, but must at least be a responsible act. To permit of this responsibility, religion must mainly be a matter of principles only. It cannot be a matter of rules. The moment it degenerates into rules, it ceases to be a religion. as it kills responsibility, which is the essence of truly religious act. What is this Hindu religion? Is it a set of principles or is it a code of rules? Now, the Hindu religion, as contained in the Vedas and the Smritis, is nothing but a mass of sacrificial, social, political, and sanitary rules and regulations, all mixed up. What is called religion by the Hindus is nothing but a multitude of commands and prohibitions. Religion, in the sense of spiritual principles, truly universal, applicable to all races, to all countries, to all times, is not to be found in them. And if it is, it does not form the governing part of a Hindu's life. That for a Hindu, dharma means commands and prohibition is clear from the way the word dharma used in Vedas and the Smritis and understood by the commentators. The word dharma, as used in the Vedas, in most cases means religious ordinances or rites. Even Jaimini, in his Purva Mimamsa, defines dharma as a desirable goal or result that is indicated by injunctive Vedic passages. To put it in plain language, what the Hindu call religion is really a law, or at best legalized class ethics. Frankly, I refuse to call this code of ordinances as religion. The first evil of such a code of ordinances, misrepresented to the people as religion, is that it tends to deprive moral life of freedom and spontaneity, and to reduce it for the conscientious at any rate to a more or less anxious and servile conformity to externally impose rules. Under it, there is no loyalty to idols. There is only conformity to commands. But the worst evil of this code of ordinances is that the laws it contains must be the same yesterday, today, and forever. There are iniquities in that they are not the same for one class as for another. But this iniquity is made perpetual in that they are prescribed to be the same for all generations. The objectionable part of such a scheme is not that they are made by a certain person called prophets or lawgivers. The objectionable part is that this code has been invested with a character of finality and fixity. Happiness notoriously varies with the conditions and circumstances of a person, as well as with the conditions of different people and epochs. That being the case, how can humanity endure this code of eternal laws without being cramped and without being crippled? I have therefore no hesitation in saying that such a religion must be destroyed. And I say there is nothing irreligious in working for the destruction of such a religion. Indeed, I hold that it is your bounden duty to tear the mask, to remove the misrepresentation that has caused by misnaming this law as religion. This is an essential step for you. Once you clear the minds of the people of this misconception and enable them to realize that what they are told as religion is not religion, but that it is really a law, you will be in a position to urge for its amendment or abolition. So long as people look upon it as religion, they will not read it for a change, because the idea of religion is, generally speaking, not associated with the idea of change. But the idea of law is associated with the idea of change. And when people come to know that what is called religion is really law, old and archaic, they will be ready for a change. For people know and accept that law can be changed. Should I further go ahead?
I think we discussed this paragraph.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Baba Sahib has given differentiation between rules and principles. So principles are to be followed with conscious mind. You have to use your thinking power, whether the act is good or bad. But the rules are prescribed as a law. You have to do this, forcefully telling the people. So in these Vedas and Smritis, these are the rules to be followed by the people, and these are not the principles. So this is their religion. So Baba says that this religion is of rules, code of conduct, and people must follow. But so we have to convince people that these are the rules and they are not for benefit of you, and these rules can be changed. This law can be changed to make the system. To if you want to break this system, it can be changed because people think that this is permanent. They cannot change this. So we have to cleanse the mind of people to get rid of the religion. The ideas, we must convince them.
Okay, ma'am. Mangesh sir.
I think this is a very important discussion that here we have is principles and rules. So most of the times we talk about the religion in terms of the rules, but not in terms of the principles. Now, if we look at the Manusmriti and all these Smritis, they are nothing but the system of rules. You shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do that. But the principle is not explained as to why you should do it. So the question of why is the question of principles, and the question of how you do it is a question of rules. So rules, either you make the rules or break the rules. That's what Baba Ambedkar has said. I don't know whether he has said it here. You have to follow the rule. Either you break it, or but principles gives you an opportunity to have these rules very rules practiced in the light of the reason and light of the morality. So I think we have to understand that we need the religion of rules or religion of principle. And the religion of principle, when we talk about, we have to really talk about the principles. Now why I'm saying this, because see, for example, the rules are basically is the purview of laws, because the laws prescribe certain rules. Now if the law is governed by the Manusmriti, not by the Constitution of India, then what kind of the rules that we see in the society? So for example, the principles of the constitutional principles have given us scope for humanitarian rules between the human beings. But what happens is, because the minds of the people is dominated by the not by the Indian Constitution but by the Constitution of Manu, what happens is people follow those rules which are prescribed there, not they do not adhere to the principles. So I think somehow we have to bring in the legal authority, the constitutional authority, to reform the religions, including Hindu religion or any religion. So for example, when it comes to India, there is no law above the Constitution of India. No sacred book is above the Constitution of India. It cannot be, because that's the religion is your private affair, that what you do with your belief. But when you talk about the social thing, it has to be governed by the Constitution of India, the highest law of the land. So I think but the law of the land is not based on the Constitution of India, it's based on the Constitution of Manu. That's why we call it Manuvad. So this is a very interesting sort of a question that we see today in our country.
Yes, Naval sir wants to say something.
Yeah, hi, Sonika. Thanks, Sonika. I was just wanted to basically, when I was listening to the reading, two quick thought struck to my mind actually. What I feel personally is, unless and until we are able to convince, we should, yes, I agree to the Pankaj that we should target OBCs rather than the upper caste. Unless we are able to make them understand the why behind what. Okay. For example, there are two things we discussed, like principle versus rule. Now, if you dig into detail, like we all know that the Ganesh Chaturthi was initiated by uh, Gangadhar Tilak just for, it was a tool to gather the people. There was no intention after that. But you see what happened after the independence. They made it, the upper caste guys, they made it as a rule, and they made it as like a custom or a tradition that every year they just choose a particular month to celebrate that for a particular duration. Second thing was the religion versus law. Uh, a very small things I noticed actually. You see that in Hindu religion, they normally, or the upper caste, like they avoid eating non-veg. I don't know for what reason, what they say that they're not supposed to eat, but they do it sometimes. But normally they avoid. But you see that how they made it a law, like they selected a particular month as a Shravan and convinced almost everyone that you are not supposed to eat any type of non-veg in this month. So, and these people don't understand this why behind what. So that's what I feel like. Unless we are able to explain them, it's difficult to bring them in our flow.
Yes. We must target first OBC. We must be able to convince them because they are majority and most ignorant part of the society.
Not ignorant, madam. I'm telling, like, there are many people along with us, like with our generation, who are taking benefits from the quota system. They call them on paper themselves as SC, ST, and T. Like I'm talking about the case of Maharashtra. Okay, all backward classes. They take all the facilities from the quota system, but when the time comes, like April 14th or December 6th, you ask them, they hardly turn towards you for this.
Yeah, that is our fault, our community fault. But they understand the difference. These OBCs don't understand the difference. They feel that Hindu religion is sacred for them.
Yes. No, somehow these upper caste guys are like brainwash them so heavily that they consider them probably their they're like, you know, they're like, no, the second most after them. Okay. So they consider that way, that after Brahmins, we are the one. There's no one else. That's how they've been convinced somehow.
Yeah. They are doing their efforts, best efforts to maintain their supremacy. And our efforts are too less. It is like knee jerk.
Exactly, and they're passing it to their even the young generations also. Like, so we are staying away. Pankaj, myself, we are staying away from India, and we see that they are able to take it to their even younger generation. Like we notice that here out of India very keenly that even a younger generation is going on the same track what their father, what their grandfather were doing. Okay. Exactly, and they're into like SC, ST, OBCs. They're all here. So we notice that very closely here.
Yeah, they are dedicated to their work.
Exactly.
And we are not.
Yes.
We are indifferent.
Unfortunately, we are not.
Yeah, adding to the Nawal's point, the way are like, they are brainwashing from the childhood. If there are like lots of examples in Pune and every nukkad and gully, there is already RSS branch they set up, and next to Vihara there is RSS branch, and people, all the OBCs and all the maybe I don't know whether SCST goes on or not, but they always brainwash these people by setting up those asking all the childs and to pray mantras and preach them the Vedas, and so those are like, they are having branch in every nukkad and gully of Pune and maybe across all the India. And in the light of that, we have a great alternative of setting up a viharas on every nukkad and gullies, to just get them, give them an alternative path to part of Buddhism. I think the path of Buddhism will definitely lead us to a great progress of their mind, and to live a life of dignity, to live a life of self-respect, which Baba Sahib is always envisioned. So I think that needs to be channelized from every nukkad and gully, I can say.
I would like to share one quick example, if I get just less than a minute time. I have a close colleague who is a BTech. Okay, he has a younger son, and he told me a scenario where he is supposed to cut his hair. His boy is hardly now, I think, into 4th year. It seems in his custom, normally in North India it happens. Please correct me if I'm wrong. They cut the hair only in the odd year, not in the even year. So now, due to this COVID, as we don't have a normal or regular flights from Gulf, he skipped that now. And he told me very happily that, Naval, I'm not going to cut the hair of my son for another year. So now he's going to cut the hair of his, it will be now, he will be 5 years old when he will cut his hair. So imagine now that somehow, how they're convinced on this matter. I told him, like, it doesn't make any sense. You can cut it here. But he's unable to, he said, like, no, I have to take him to a particular place in India. There only I have to cut it when he is into odd years. You see, like, it's not only the like less educated or illiterate people are falling prey to this. Even highly intellectual guys, even they are falling prey to all these practices.
All right, I think we should move on, and then we can come back to this discussion again.
Yeah. Rajpal Singh, sir, would you like to say something?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, sir, please.
I just want to add that it is really said that the religion is the best franchisee system. People add their children automatically, but it is much better than the MBA or any other franchisee system. The OBC are adding their children themselves to the religion they are born in. That's one. It came into my mind.
Okay. So we'll continue. I think Uma ma'am wants to read.
So you're going to share?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Chapter 25. While I condemn a religion of rules, I must not be understood to hold the opinion that there is no necessity for a religion. On the contrary, I agree with Burke when he says that true religion is the foundation of society, the basis on which all true civil government rests, and both their sanction. Consequently, when I urge that these ancient rules of life be annulled, I am anxious that its place shall be taken by a religion of principles which alone can lay claim to being a true religion. Indeed, I am so convinced of the necessity of religion that I feel I ought to tell you in outline what I regard as necessary items in this religious reform. The following, in my opinion, should be the cardinal items in this reform. Number one, there should be one and only one standard book of Hindu religion, acceptable to all Hindus and recognized by all Hindus. This, of course, means that all other books of Hindu religion, such as Vedas, Shastras, and Puranas, which are treated as sacred and authoritative, must by law cease to be so, and the preaching of any doctrine, religious or social, contained in these books should be penalized. Number two, it should be better if priesthood among Hindus was abolished. But as this seems to be impossible, the priesthood must at least cease to be hereditary. Every person who professes to be a Hindu must be eligible for being a priest. It should be provided by law that no Hindu shall be entitled to be a priest unless he has passed an examination prescribed by the state and holds a sanad from the state permitting him to practice. 3. No ceremony performed by a priest who does not hold a sanad shall be deemed to be valid in law, and it should be made penal for a person who has no sanad to officiate as a priest. Number 4, a priest should be the servant of the state and should be subject to the disciplinary action by the state in the matter of his morals, beliefs, and worship, in addition to his being subject, along with other citizens, to the ordinary law of the land. Number 5, the number of priests should be limited by law according to the requirements of the state, as is done in the case of the ICS. To some, this may sound radical, but to my mind, there is nothing revolutionary in this. Every profession in India is regulated. Engineers must show proficiency, doctor must show proficiency, lawyers must show proficiency before they are allowed to practice their professions. During the whole of their career, they must not only obey the law of the land, civil as well as criminal, but they must also obey the special code of morals prescribed by their respective professions. The priest is the only profession where proficiency is not required. The profession of a Hindu priest is the only profession which is not subject to any code. Mentally, a priest may be an idiot. Physically, a priest may be suffering from a foul disease such as syphilis or gonorrhea. Morally, he may be a wreck. But he is fit to officiate at solemn ceremonies, to enter the sanctum sanctorum of a Hindu temple and worship the Hindu god. All this becomes possible among the Hindus because for a priest, it is enough to be born in a priestly caste. The whole thing is abominable and is due to the fact that the priestly class among Hindus is subject neither to law nor to morality. It recognizes no duties. It knows only of rights and privileges. It is a pest which divinity seems to have let loose on the masses for their mental and moral degradation. The priestly class must be brought under control by some such legislation as I have outlined above. It will prevent it from doing mischief and from misguiding people. It will democratize it by throwing it open to everyone. It will certainly help to kill the Brahmanism and will also help to kill caste, which is nothing but Brahmanism incarnate. Brahmanism is the poison which has spoiled Hinduism. You will succeed in saving Hinduism if you will kill Brahmanism. There should be no opposition to this reform from any quarter. It should be welcomed even by the Arya Samajis, because this is merely an application of their own doctrine of guna karma. Whether you do that or you do not, you must give a new doctrinal basis to your religion, a basis that will be in consonance with liberty, equality, and fraternity, in short, with democracy. I am no authority on the subject, but I am told that for such religious principles as will be in consonance with liberty, equality, and fraternity, it may not be necessary for you to borrow from foreign sources, and that you could draw for such principles on the Upanishads. Whether you could do so without a complete remolding, a considerable scraping and chipping off the ore they contain, is more than I can say. This means a complete change in the fundamental notions of life. It means a complete change in the values of life. It means a complete change in outlook and in attitude towards men and things. It means conversion, but if you do not like the word, I will say it means new life. But a new life cannot enter a body that is dead. New life can center only in a new body. The old body must die before a new body can come into existence and a new life can enter into it. To put it simply, the old must cease to be operative before the new can begin to enliven and to pulsate. This is what I meant when I said you must discard the authority of the Shastras and destroy the religion of the Shastras. We continue, we take a pause here.
I think this also section is one of the master stroke by Baba Saheb Ambedkar, where he is suggesting the reforms, and he is suggesting how these reforms cannot be agreeable to all. And in essence, he is suggesting that the so-called Hinduism is hijacked by the Brahmins, and we have to destroy the authority of the Brahmins. So he is suggesting very beautiful reforms here. His 5 points are so important for reforming the Hinduism. That effectively means killing the Brahmanism, the authority of the Brahmins to officiate and lord over the other Hindus. So I think, you know, this is very important suggestion that Baba Saheb Ambedkar has given here. Any comments, Umaji?
So every time you read Baba Saheb, the stunning directness and the precision of words just tears through. So I think I experienced that once more. But I think one was a dilemma, which coming from Tamil Nadu, I also have. Yes, you're right. As the Dravidian parties, we've been able to, in some way, self-respect movement has brought back some identity for the non-Brahmins, and it's not such a Brahminical state anymore. But somebody else takes over that position. It's not the Brahmins, but it's another caste within the OBC or the graded inequality that takes over. So I'm not the Brahminical thinking. I think all of us have got it. I'm not sure it is any longer restricted only with the Brahmins. In Hinduism, I'm saying. That was my to say, is it really restricted to the Brahmins anymore?
You know, there has been an attempt in Tamil Nadu to have the examination for the priests.
Yes.
And I think, you know, this suggestion that there has to be some examination for the priest is very important, because the priests are hereditary. They just go on and on after one generation, after another generation. I think one of the things is that all those temple committees, for example, Tirupati Balaji, is completely, the trust is completely hijacked by the Brahmins. And at one point of time in Andhra Pradesh, they had such a wealth in Tirupati, they wanted to give the insurance to all the Brahmins of the Andhra Pradesh. You know that? They suggested that, you know, they will give insurance to all the Brahmins of Andhra Pradesh, the Tirupati Balaji Trust. So I think all this, like this Padmanabhan Trust in Kerala, where they have discovered so much of wealth and gold, it has to be nationalized. So I think the suggestion that all the temples should be nationalized, because in this country, there is also an economy called the temple economy. A lot of things happen through the temples. A lot of things, negotiation happens through the Babas. Even the arms dealing, like Chandra Swami was there in the past, who was doing this dealing between these people. And even today, these big Babas or Sadhus, they are nothing but the power brokers. Yep. So, you know, I think this suggestion is very good. These 5 points, I think we should argue on this basis. Okay, what problem one should have if a Dalit becomes a priest? What problems and OBC, you know, they should have if the OBC becomes a priest? Okay, we will go to the extent. What problems they should have if the women become the priest? So, for example, in Sabrimala, controversy in Sabrimala, where the women are not allowed to enter the temples. There are so many temples. So I think, you know, what Baba Saheb Ambedkar is suggesting here is really killing the Brahmanism. And once the Brahmanism is out and the Hinduism become more egalitarian, with having no class to suck the blood of others, then I think that is the reform that Baba Saheb Ambedkar is suggesting. Right?
Yep. It's also true of the New Age gurus.
New Age gurus. True.
Yeah.
Ma'am, what I know, this for Brahmins, this test is mandatory, I think. I just recently happened to discuss with one of my friend when there is a job threat to everyone in Gulf countries. I jokingly said him, your business is good. Why don't you do that business of preaching and all that? So he also very sportingly said me, it is not easy nowadays to become a priest because his father was a head priest in which area I forgot. It is South Indian area, and they were given a big a house and all facilities, but they have to pass because his father was already established. But he, my friend, he said it was not easy for him to clear the exam. They have to give some exam in the mud, and that is one obstacle to him. And other obstacle to him is that there is no much advantage nowadays in that profession. People become aware, they don't give dakshina to Brahmins and all that. So there is no point in continuing that profession of priest. So that one feedback or true insights I got from one of my Brahmin friend recently.
Yes. So we have to ask them, you don't officiate, let a Dalit take over the temple. Or let an OBC take over the temple. Let some women take over the temple.
That they don't. As long as they are not into that, they don't bother about whosoever it takes it. It is very clear.
It's a very money-minded business. A normal temple has an economy of at least 5 lakh rupees. You know why there are so many temples around here? Why there are so many Sai temples? Do you think they run, on charity? No. So much money is, is given to the temple by donation.
Yes, it is rule, no, ultimately, Mangesh bhai. It is a set rule. Person who is entering the temple will first take the plate. He will pay money, 10 rupees something. First he will pay to the beggar, then he will take that mala. Then he will go to Dan Peti and put 10 rupees. So it is set by rule. I mean, no one can break it. Very funny business, huh?
You see, there are a lot of jokes on WhatsApp. If you are really smart, you should become a Baba.
Yeah.
And then you have wealth, you have power, you have everything. So that it's not easy to relinquish that. The power, the priestly power.
And every profession in India is regulated. Engineers must show proficiency, doctors, lawyers. But these priests, they can be he can be idiot. He doesn't require any education. He may be he may not be having any morality. He may be suffering from any disease like syphilis. Till he can become priest.
True.
Mangesh bhai, you're actually spot on. Actually, you got that point about Sai Baba. I'm not sure whether in today's meet we have anybody from South India, especially from Tamil Nadu. Okay, I want to share this my own experience actually. Actually, my in-laws are from Tiruchirappalli. So it is like before 4 or 5 years there was no Sai Baba's existence in Tiruchirappalli. Okay. When I went before 4 or 5 years, someone told me that in one of the early morning, somebody walked like he was in like the way Sai Baba looks like old age with this stick and headscarf and all. He came and he just asked somebody food and he offered him a food and asked him something that I'm facing some problem. So you see that this is how it was like cultivated. There's no sign before 4 or 5 years of Sai Baba in that part at least. Trichy or after that, like Trichy, Madurai, Rameshwaram or till Nagarkoil. Okay. But now within that span, after 4 or 5 years, it spread till date, like till down south now. So it's like it's emerging after some time. Like it was nowhere before 4 or 5 years. You spotted it very, very like it's a business for them. Okay. Wherever there is chance or opportunity, they will make it. They will take it to the every corner, wherever they can.
Yeah.
Muthu sir is with us from South. Sir, do you
Yeah,
want?
Yeah, he's in the right person, Muthu.
yes, yes. I do
Explain,
agree.
you can
I do
explain this.
agree with you.
Yes.
This happened in my village. The village I was born, it is almost 5-10 kilometers from Kanyakumari. There was no Sai Baba temple there. There a lot of people used to migrate from there to Mumbai. So one of our people who settled in Mumbai, we established a Sai Baba temple with a marriage hall in our village.
See,
People are going there. They have regular pujas.
sir, before the film came no Sai Baba, there was no popular Sai Baba. It's a phenomenon of a film. Then
Yes,
Santoshi
absolutely
Mata came from the film.
Yes, yes.
So today,
Absolutely right.
if anybody would like to become a Devi or Dev in the future, make a movie on yourself, huh?
And now serials nowadays, if you see the character of serials, no, it's very attractive.
And you know one thing, Mangesh bhai. This new gurus, like new babas, no, they have taken over the conventional god of the South Indians. Like, probably like you heard of like Kartikeyan, who's like brother of Ganesha. Okay, a character in the like mythology somewhere. So these are taken like now people knows more about Sai Baba than Kartikeyan. Okay, or Muruga. Okay, Muthu will know it better. Okay, the way they took Sai Baba on their head, it's beyond Kartikeyan or even Muruga, Lord Muruga.
I have one question. This formation of temple in India in anywhere, let us say anywhere in India, is there any limitation by law?
No.
No, they can form any bank.
That is the only profession you don't need any certificate. So if you have a house on the high in the square, you just put some image there and start doing aarti every day.
Earning.
On a tree also.
On a tree also, as Sonika said.
It's nearby my house only. It was a tree, banyan tree, and it was. I'm here since 5 to 6 years, and I'm seeing it is normally there. But since last 1 year only, people started placing idol, and then now it's a huge temple there. And every evening and morning, priests used to come there, having their all the chantings and all, and people also visit there frequently.
Yeah, Sonika, Mangesh, like I belong to Vidarbha. Even Pankaj might be knowing. There is a place called Bahiram. It's on the border of Maharashtra and MP. Okay, you know that temple is built on about a stone, a big stone. There's no other idol in that. People worship, and every year, 1 month there is a called like Yatra, Jatra, whatever. Okay, every year, 1 month it goes continuously, and there's only a big stone, nothing else, no other idol. They call it like Bairam Baba. Okay.
Yeah. I have a very funny story to tell you. I don't know whether you will like it or not. Once what happened in the village, it's a true story. Huh? Once what happened in the village, in the night, there was a man who was wandering on the street with his friend. And then he had a sudden urge to relieve himself. He had a nature's call. So what he did, there was nowhere to go. So he did it on the, on the chalk of the village. And then what happened, he thought, it will look very absurd in the morning. So he put up some flowers there. Okay, the next morning, people came and they thought that it's some kind of an auspicious thing. So people came and started worshipping it. And I heard that, the people who told me the story told me that now that thing has become a temple, small temple. No, I think, any absurdity can happen. I tell you, this is such a country where any absurdity can take place. When I was growing up, there was a Baba in Vidarbha called Vittu Baba. And all our Vidarbha folks used to go to take the blessing. And that Baba only give galis to you.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Mangesh, my grandmother used to go there. I still remember.
And his hands were tied, his legs were tied because he was some kind of a lunatic. Sorry, if there are any Vittu Baba Bhakts here. And only thing he used to do was give galis. And the more galis he will give you, the more ugly galis he will give you, the more blessed you will be.
You're right.
So there will be competition to get galis from Vittu Baba. So there are many stories like that.
there's a big temple for him. Like there's a place called Kavitha. It's probably around 45 kilometers from Amravati. It's a very big temple, huge temple.
Yeah, Takal Ghat. His place was Takal Ghat.
Yeah, it's near Karajgaon.
Alka madam knows Takal Ghat.
Yeah, Takal
It's near
Ghat.
Karajgaon. I think it's Karajgaon or Shirajgaon, somewhere near that.
Yes. Anyway, should we go on reading further?
Yes, sir. Okay, we will continue. Sangdina will read next. Yeah. Sangdina. Yeah, continue.
Okay. I have kept you too long. It is time I brought this address to a close. This would have been a convenient point for me to have stopped, but this would probably be my last address to a Hindu audience on a subject vitally concerning the Hindus. I would therefore like, before I close, to place before the Hindus, if they will allow me, some questions which I regard as vital and invite them seriously to consider the same. In the first place, the Hindus must consider whether it is sufficient to take the placid view of anthropologists that there is nothing to be said about the beliefs, habits, morals, and outlooks on life, which obtain among the different people of the world, except that they often differ, or whether it is not necessary to make an attempt to find out what kind of morality, beliefs, habits, and outlooks have worked best and have enabled those who pass them to flourish, to go strong, to people the earth, and to have dominion over it, as is observed by Professor Carver. Morality and religion as the organized expression of moral approval and disapproval must be regarded as factors in the struggle for existence as truly as are weapons for offense and defense, teeth and claw, horns and hooves, furs and feathers. The social group, community, tribe, or nation which develops an unworkable scheme of morality, or within which those social acts which weaken it and unfit it for survival habitually create the sentiment of approval, while those which would strengthen and enable it to be expanded habitually create the sentiment of disapproval, will eventually be eliminated. It is its habit of approval or disapproval. These are the results of religion and morality that handicapped it, as really as the possession of two wings on one side with none on the other will handicap the colony of flies. It would be as futile in the one case as in the other to argue that one system is just as good as another. Morality and religion, therefore, are not mere matters of likes and dislikes. You may dislike exceedingly a scheme of morality, which, can you just scroll up a little bit? Yeah, morality, which if you, sorry, morality and religion, therefore, are not mere matters of likes and dislikes. You may dislike exceedingly a scheme of morality, which, if universally practiced within a nation, would make that nation the strongest nation on the face of the earth. Yet, in spite of your morality, in spite of your that nation, the strongest nation on the face of the earth, yet in spite of your dislike, such a nation will become strong. You may like exceedingly a scheme of morality and an ideal of justice, which, if universally practiced within a nation, would make it enable to hold its own in the struggle with other nations. Yet, in spite of your admiration, this nation will eventually disappear. The Hindus must therefore examine their religion and then morality in terms of their survival value. Secondly, the Hindus must consider whether they should conserve the whole of their social heritage or select what is helpful and transmit to future generations. Only that, only that much and no more. Professor John Dewey, who was my teacher and to whom I owe so much, has said, every society gets encumbered with what is tribal, with deed moved from the past, and with what is positively preserved. As a society becomes more enlightened, it realizes that it is responsible not to conserve and transmit the whole of its existing achievements, but only such as make for a better future society. Even Brooke, in spite of the vehemence with which he opposed the principle of chance embodied in the French Revolution, was compelled to admit that a state without the means of some change is without the means of its conservation. Without such means, it might even risk the just scroll it. The laws, sorry, the laws of the part of the Constitution, which it wished the most religiously to preserve. What Brooke said of a state applies equally to a society. Thirdly, the Hindus must consider whether they must not cease to worship the past as supplying its ideals. The beautiful effect of this worship of the past are best summed up by Professor Dewey when he says, an individual can live only in the present. The present is not just something which comes after the past, much less something produced by it. It is what life is in leaving the past behind. The study of past products will not help us to understand the present. A knowledge of the past and its heritage is of great significance when it enters into the present, but not otherwise. And the mistake of making the record and remains of the past the main material of education is that it tends to make the past a rival of the present and the present a more or less futile imitation of the past. The principle which makes little of the present act of living and growing naturally looks upon the present as empty and upon the future as remote. Such a principle is inimical to progress and is an hindrance to a strong and a steady current of life. Fourthly, the Hindus must consider whether the time has not come for them to recognize that there is nothing fixed, nothing eternal, nothing sanatan, that everything is changing, that change is the law of life for individuals as well as for society. In a changing society, there must be a constant revolution of old values, and the Hindus must realize that if there must be standard to measure the act of men, there must also be a readiness to revise those standards.
Finish it.
Okay.
Okay, we discuss. All right, I think this is the last but one section of the annihilation of caste. And as we have seen that Baba Saheb Ambedkar has argued from all different directions about how the caste can be annihilated. And here he says that it's like some kind of a supplement to his address, where he talks about this first point, second point, third point, and fourth point. I think these points are so important, not only for in terms of the annihilation of caste, but as a guide to our life and for the nation. So in the first paragraph, Baba Saheb Ambedkar talks about the importance of morality and how the moral standards, even if they hurt an individual, are important for the nation. And the nation can become Vishwa Guru only when it has those kind of a high standard of ethics and morality. Right? We cannot become Vishwa Guru, or we cannot become a great nation on the earth or a strong nation on the earth unless we have a scheme of morality that benefits all. and the caste morality doesn't benefit all. Therefore, any dream of thinking that this nation will be great one day without annihilation of the caste is an impossibility. Number one. Number two, that the past and the present. So we cannot have the past become the rival of the present, because the present is very different from the past. When the Manusmriti or whatever those foolish books were written, that time there was no computer, there was no Zoom, there was no WhatsApp, there was no aeroplanes, there was no railway, there was nothing. And even when the humanity has advanced so far, the people in India are still living in the past, 2,500 200 years back, whatever the ideas were there. On the TV they are showing this one god sends an atom bomb from his arrow, another god sends an atom bomb from their arrow, they collide. These are the stories which people that they are true. A lot of people have told me that in the Vedas there is a theory of atom bomb, or there is a theory of aeroplane. Then I asked them, if there is an aeroplane, there has to be some kind of a science behind it. The science demand methods. If there is an aeroplane, there is a definite method by which the aeroplane has arrived. There are certain principles of aerodynamics that are there, without which the aeroplane won't fly. So mere saying that there was a flying object, but there was no explanation as to how that flying object came into being, is nothing but the fullness. It's nothing but the foolishness. So we are very fond of saying that our country had a very golden age, everything was beautiful, everything was nice, there were aeroplanes, there was a plastic surgery, that Ganesha had a plastic surgery. How is it possible that on a small neck of a boy you can fix the head of the what is called the Ganesha? Impossible, no? Even if let's assume that the science was so advanced that they could do such kind of a plastic surgery. Now how can you put on the small neck that big head of an elephant? Impossible. So like that, and here Baba Saheb Ambedkar gives this kind of he comments that he owes so much to the John Dewey, and his teacher, he owes so much. So we have to, as an Ambedkarite, we have to know who is John Dewey, what is his thought, what are his philosophies, like that. So this paragraph second is very important. Paragraph third is the same on the line of the past and the heritage. Always we try to glorify the past, but what about present? What about today? What about now? Isn't it? So we have to find a way not to live in the excessive past, because living in the past is not a good idea, because the present is different from the past. And the fourth is very important, that there is nothing fixed, nothing eternal, nothing Sanatan. But we have been told that there is something Sanatan, there is something fixed, something which is not going to change, eternal. So how can it be? Change is the law of the nature. Without change we won't exist. Because of the reality of the change, the whole evolution takes place. Otherwise nothing will evolve, everything will be, nothing can come into existence without change. So Baba Saheb Ambedkar is saying these four things very importantly here in the end of it, that why we do not need caste, how it is detrimental to the present. Even today, when our country could have become such a great country, we have a democracy, we have such a beautiful constitution, our country is endowed with natural resources that are not there in any country. The largest arable land, the rainfall is abundant, we are a monsoon country. Despite of that, we get enough sunshine. Despite of that, if you look at our progress, is nothing. All the resources are mismanaged. Why? Because of this attitude of caste, living in the past, not in the present, has been causing a lot of damage to the country, to our country. So I think these are very important 4 points that Baba Saheb Ambedkar has raised here. We can discuss. If there are no points for discussion, Sonika?
Yes, anyone? Shashank, you want to say something?
Yeah.
Yeah, please.
I think I'm just wants to explore more on the last paragraph of section 24. It's beautiful. I think it would be great if you throw some light on that. Baba Saheb says that we need a complete change in the fundamental notions of life, complete change in value, and complete change in outlook and attitude. And Baba Sahib, gives a wonderul meaning to the conversion. It means a new life. New life cannot enter a body that is dead. New life can enter only in a new body. The old body must die before a new body can come into existence, and a new life can enter into it. So, in this, Mangesh sir, can you just throw light on these beautiful, lines? What does it mean by, this? Yeah.
I think this is very important paragraph that Shashank you are highlighted, because this attitude towards men and things. Men means both women and men, huh? And things means what surrounds us, environment, our communities, our resources. So what has happened is, when I always give this example, if you go to other countries, we find that people have a very strong sense of the public spaces. For example, if you go in the gardens, say for example in Japan, if you go to the gardens are so beautiful, the buses are so beautiful, and so well kept, because the people have a feeling that it belongs to us. Now if you go to a bus in India, public bus in India, what happens? People inscribe with pen whatever they can, the names of their lovers, and anything they can do it there. If you go to the public garden, we eat something and throw it everywhere. Now why this attitude is there? Attitude has an outlook that this thing belongs to others, it doesn't belong to me. And people are not generally responsible for that. So there is an attitude among the people, particularly in our country, that we try to spit anywhere everywhere, thinking that it doesn't matter to me. We think that because we think that there is somebody who will take care of this garbage. Somebody will clean my shit. You see what I'm saying? So what I'm trying to get it at, in terms of this paragraph, is the fundamental notions of life. This is a very important question. So we have to check what are our notions of life. And when we look at the notions of life, that those which inhibit our brains, in our minds, we say that they are fundamentally wrong. Our attitudes are fundamentally wrong, and they need radical change. They need radical changes in our own minds. For example, we are also conditioned to think in terms of the caste. Even if we deny that, we don't think in terms of the caste, but most of the times we think in terms of the caste. For example, in communities that we are talking about, we talk about, a lot of people say that they are decaste. They don't believe in the caste. Then we ask them, who did you marry? They say that we married from the same caste. No problem. But when you wanted to marry, when you wanted to go for arranged marriage. So for example, let's look at the Dalits, whether they have thought of marrying, say for example, if there is somebody from Uttar Pradesh, whether they have ever thought of marrying a person from, say, Tamil Nadu. Or from, for example, the person from Tamil Nadu ever thought of marrying a person from Maharashtra. Why I'm giving this illustration is because we have still these attitudes inbuilt into us, because the society in which we live, a lot of things have just percolated our brains, a lot of things have just percolated our consciousness, and they have settled in our consciousness as a fixed belief, isn't it? So we want a revolution within, a radical change in an attitude, not only within us but also others, so that we look at human beings as human beings, not human beings in terms of their caste, in terms of their race. We look at the things not just for exploitation but for the conservation point of view, how we conserve the public property, so on and so forth. So I think this is very important, that that we have to rejuvenate, we have to relive, we have to reactivate the whole mindsets, the whole communities. That's what I think Baba Sahib Ambedkar is suggesting here. In other words, we have to reset everything. Just like cell phone has a lot of encumbrances that we put into, and then it gets hung, and then we have to reset it, reformat it. I think India needs this kind of a reformatting, resetting, and we all need it, because our brains are so much. There are a lot of cookies in our brains. So many caches accumulated from the past, that we need to refresh our minds, and we can do it through being mindful of the present, thinking about what benefits the humanity, so on and so forth.
Yeah.
I
It
think
means
what I want to add to the point, that what Shashank was saying, that the body has to die to take a new life. Here, the Baba Sahib was trying to explain about the Sanatan Dharma, what that every nothing is Sanatan. If we imagine that if we born like a small baby, we if it is Sanatan, we could remain as a small baby, then we will never grow. So the cells, if we see in the scientific way, that the cells are becoming and changing and becoming, and then we are growing up and going older and older, and then we are going to the last stage of our life. So everything, it's a pure science that we are, nothing is permanent. Secondly, that what we are thinking that the dharma has been formed, everything is permanent, that they have shown that this that there is a way, this is the only way of practice has to be then. Sir, the Sanatan Dharma means that there are the four varnas, that Brahmins are the Brahmins and they have all knowledge. But Baba Saheb has abolished that, say that the Brahmins doesn't have all knowledge. Every class of the society is having knowledge. This is not the Sanatan Dharma is saying that the Brahmins are only having the knowledge, Kshatriyas can only fight, and so on and so forth. So Baba Saheb was trying to explain people in that way, that this is not a Sanatan Dharma. We can have that. We have the tendency to change. Everything is changing. Everything is changing. Nothing is permanent here in the world. Thank you.
Now, very good point, Sumit bhai. Now here, Baba Saheb Ambedkar has said that, this is his last address to the Hindus. After that, he hasn't addressed the Hindus like this, because after this speech in Evla, Baba Saheb Ambedkar declared that he sees no hope in Hinduism, and though he was born in so-called Hindu society, that was not in his hand, but he will not die in the Hindu society. So this speech and the speech that we have studied, what way liberty, mukti kon pathe, they have the resonance. You remember we have studied this speech, Mukti Kon Pathe?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
These two speeches have a resonance, and we have to really understand the resonance between these two speeches.
Path of salvation, you are saying, trying to say.
Mukti Kon Pathe, yes. What way liberty? So, should we read the last paragraph and then we conclude for tonight?
Sir, it's only 4 minutes left. So
okay, somebody can read it in 4 minutes, no, because I don't think there is much to discuss there.
Okay. So, Shashank sir, would you like to?
Yes.
Okay,
Definitely, I will read it quickly. Yeah.
I think Pankaj sir wanted to read.
Yeah. I'm so sorry. Yes, sir. Pankaj sir, please.
Go ahead.
Okay. Go ahead.
Yes.
Conclusion. I have to confess that this address has become too lengthy. Whether this fault is compensated by any extent, by breadth or depth, is a matter for you to judge. All I claim is to have told you candidly my views. I have little to recommend them, but some study and a deep concern in your destiny. If you will allow me to say, these views are the views of a man who has been no tool of power, no flatterers or greatness. They came from one, almost the whole public expression has been one continuous struggle for liberty, for the poor and for the oppressed, and whose only reward has been a continuous shower of calumny and abuse from national journals and national leaders. For no other reason except that I refuse to join with them in performing the miracle, I will not say trick, of liberating the oppressed with the gold of the tyrant and raising the poor with the cash of the rich. All this may not be enough to condemn my views. I think they are not likely to alter yours. But whether they do or do not, the responsibility is entirely yours. You must make your efforts to uproot caste. If not in my way, then in your way. I am sorry, I will not be with you. I have decided to change. This is not the place for giving reason. But even when I am gone out of your fold, I will watch your movement with active sympathy, and you will have my assistance for what it may be worth. Yours is a national cause. Caste is no doubt primarily the breath of the Hindus, but the Hindus have fouled the air all over, and everybody is infected. Sikh, Muslim, and Christians. You therefore deserve the support of all those who are suffering from this infection. Sikh, Muslim, and Christians. Yours is more difficult than the other national cause, nearly Swaraj, than other national cause, namely Swaraj. In the fight of Swaraj, you fight with the whole nation on your side. In this, you have to fight against the whole nation, and that to your own. But this is more important than Swaraj. There is no use having Swaraj if you cannot defend it. More important than the question of defending Swaraj is the question of defending the Hindus under Swaraj. In my opinion, only when the Hindu society become a casteless society, that it can hope to have strength enough to defend itself. Without such internal strength, Swaraj of Hindus may turn out to be only a step towards slavery. Goodbye, and good wishes for your success.
I think this is very explanatory, this thing, but it's in the personal pronouns, I, because Baba Sahib Ambedkar is saying, you know, his fight is not for the greatness, or he is not using it as a tool of power. And his views are coming from his own struggle to destroy this monster of the caste. And he says that, you know, he has been showered with continuous calumny and abuse from national journals and national leaders. So we can see that, you know, what kind of the personal life, you know, when you speak the truth to the power, what kind of the difficulties that you need to face all the time in your life. And he says that when you fight for the Swaraj, the entire country is behind you. But when you fight for the defense of the people, defending the people, nobody comes to you. And he has raised a very important question before that, you know, what is important, the freedom of land or the freedom of man, right? So this annihilation of caste has to be looked at from the fight for the freedom of the people, not for the freedom of land. And that is the great fight that we have to fight. And I think this is very important, sort of a last paragraph in the personal pronoun. Any comments before we conclude? Sonika, any comments?
Anyone wants to share their views? No, I don't think so, sir.
Before we end today, I would like to say that we have not yet finished reading the annihilation of caste, because there are a lot of things that are coming up, and we will go for 1 or 2 more sessions where I would like to have your personal comments, personal take on it. In one of the sessions, Pankaj is going to summarize what he has learned and how we can use it using new tools of management to understand the annihilation of caste. I would request you again to read it through again and come up with your points so that we can have an open discussion very soon.
Great. Yes, I will do that. Thank you, Mangesh. Thank you.
Uma ma'am, you want to say something?
Oh, it was very happy we come this far, reading it together. That's all.
Yeah.
So the last thing. Yeah.
Yes,
so just
sir.
the last thing. Mangesh sir, I think आप शायद बोलना भूल गए. Like in 16th century there was aeroplane which came from the sky, and it took the famous Saint Sant Tukaram. Okay. So if we don't stop these guys, like they are capable, bringing another aeroplane to take away some good person from us. So that's what my say on this. We have to stop the nonsense.
Okay, sir. So, shall we conclude today's session? If no more questions or any sharing of views is there. Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for joining today's session. It was as usual a wonderful session. Okay, sir. It was again a wonderful session we had today, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you, Sonika, for hosting it so nicely and so kindly, and for having such a patience. Thank you so much to you. Thank you all.
Thank you so much to you, sir, for such a good moderation of the session. Okay. Jai Bhim.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Jai Bhim, thank you so much.
Okay.
Jai Bhim, thank you everyone.